In this episode of the Weekly Scroll, we're going to take a look at the similarities between what's going on in Israel and America as it relates to things that are happening on the southern border, both our southern border and Israel's southern border.
If you enjoy watching this and other great content from Jacob's Tent, download the Jacob's Tent app today. Gain access to the latest videos, teachings, and exclusive content all in one location. Stay connected and up to date with everything happening in the tent with the Jacob's Tent app, available on the App Store, Google Play, or wherever you find your apps.
Well, welcome again to the Weekly Scroll. A lot has happened over this past week. In fact, so much that in the short time we have here together, I wouldn't be able to cover all the things that I would like to. And so I've decided to focus on a couple of larger stories. At least in my view, they are the larger story. So we'll begin with this. The Mexican border state of Chihuahua issued an alert regarding a violent Venezuelan gang called Tren de Aragua, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, or TDA for short, and that's how I will refer to them from this point forward. But apparently members of this gang had been moving through Chihuahua in order to cross into the United States near El Paso, Texas. This group is considered to be a transnational criminal organization, which has been involved in human trafficking, extortion, money laundering, and drug trafficking, and poses a, quote, deadly criminal threat across the Western Hemisphere. U.S. officials had warned earlier this month that this gang, which, again, originated in Venezuela, is infiltrating the United States, which prompted Congressman Tony Gonzalez of Texas to describe TDA as a, quote, MS-13 on steroids, which MS-13, of course, is referring to another infamous gang. And according to the congressman, this group is even worse than MS-13. Members of the gang are suspected of taking over an apartment complex in Aurora, Colorado, which is a suburb of Denver. Video footage shows gang members patrolling this apartment complex property with guns, causing residents to bunker down in fear. The gang has been seen selling drugs from the apartment building, and according to one Aurora City Councilwoman, quote, without a doubt, there is sex trafficking now going on, end quote. She also went on to say, we currently have entire complexes under gang control. Complexes where staff have been beaten up, they've been threatened, their families have been threatened, and complexes where there are no staff left on the property. These complexes are being run by this gang. She went on. They start brokering apartments themselves when someone leaves out of fear or whatever. They go in and take picture of the apartment themselves. Then, as I've been told, within hours, a Venezuelan family moves in. She said the local media is downplaying this. And she said politics is being played with people's lives. Nothing is being done to help the American citizens that are being trapped under this gang's control, end quote. Now, Congressman Greg Lopez, a Republican from Colorado, confirms that this Venezuelan gang has indeed infiltrated Aurora, which, as I said, is a suburb of Denver, and that's important to keep in mind. The mayor of Aurora said that TDA has taken control of several apartment complexes in the northern part of the city in what he described as, quote, a nightmare situation, end quote. Congressman Lopez went on to say, these gangs, they operate like wild dogs. They come in small cells, they attack others. They're out there looking to control an area. If you allow them to control it, they're going to breed and they're going to spread. Now, the Democratic governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, first denied that this was going on, but when video footage surfaced that proved otherwise, he was more or less forced to change his tune. And so it needs to be pointed out here, and this is something that we're going to come back to thematically anyway, later on. It should be pointed out that Aurora, that suburb of Denver, does not share Denver's sanctuary city policies. However, the influx of illegal migrants into the Mile High City has spilled out into the suburbs. Consequently, Denver's smaller neighbors are facing a wave of criminal activity from this Venezuelan prison gang, activity that, had they instituted policies, would not have permitted this. In other words, the choices of some have dire consequences for others. Now, in a somewhat related story, in California, a group of about 20 suspected illegal migrants attempted to board a school bus that was in the process of picking up elementary school children. This incident occurred within 24 hours of another smaller group of migrants trying to board a different bus, but in the same district. Both incidences took place in San Diego County at about 11 miles north of the southern border between California and New Mexico. According to reports, a group of migrant males were walking in the middle of the highway and allegedly tried to stop the bus, which prompted the bus driver to go around the group. Now, it should be noted that none of the migrants successfully boarded either of the buses, but it should also be noted that this brazenness seems to be growing more widespread. Not as brazen as what TDA is doing in Aurora, Colorado, but brazen nevertheless. Now, here's the response by school officials. Buses will simply drive past stops with students who happen to be nearby migrants, and instead they will go on to the next stop on the route, quote, for the safety of students and bus drivers, end quote. And by the way, while we're on the subject of the state of immigration in the state of California, here's this interesting development. California has proposed giving illegal migrants in the state up to $150,000 in down payment assistance and interest-free loans. Of course, there's a cost, and that cost will be incurred by California's taxpayers. And if that's not bad enough, this proposal comes at a time when the state of California is facing almost a $50 billion deficit. And yet another related story. Massachusetts Republicans submitted a formal request with the state's government for information on the alleged $1 billion in secret migrant crisis spending. The group demanded that Governor Maura Healey's administration provide a detailed cost breakdown of the toll that the migrant crisis has caused for the state's residents. Massachusetts GOP chairwoman argued that the Democratic supermajority has created a, quote, veil of secrecy surrounding the migrant crisis. She contends that, quote, the public deserves transparency, release the details on the vendors profiting from this crisis and the public safety issues affecting our communities, end quote. This report, published by the GOP, noted that the state has already spent more than $1 billion on a sheltering program that houses migrants. One of these shelters is in Boston's Logan Airport, part of which appeared to be completely taken over by migrants. In addition to the housing issue, Massachusetts taxpayers will also have to cover schooling, social services, medical care, and public safety. Just kind of as a footnote to this, one Boston school district told 150 students that they would no longer have school bus service because those assets were being diverted to, quote, students living in hotels and shelters. And it should be noted that Massachusetts functions more or less as a sanctuary state. Now, I realize that those who raise these kinds of issues and come out against the widespread immigration crisis risk being labeled as a racist or an isolationist, uncaring, insensitive, etc., etc. My reason for sharing these stories is not to condemn immigrants per se, but to highlight the fact that because there has been a complete lack of regard for law and order, beginning with an open southern border, things across America are quickly spiraling out of control. I just read a few reports. There are dozens, if not hundreds more, of similar accounts all across the United States. So things, as I said, are spiraling out of control. So if one believes that we should accept anyone and everyone who wants to come into this country, so be it. But apparently that view has not heretofore taken into consideration the fallout from such a policy, the crime, murder, and busted budgets in state after state. So that brings me to say this. Good intentions don't always render good results. As the old saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And likewise, lawlessness, whether it is a border issue or something else, nevertheless, lawlessness never ends in goodness. Should we say that illegal immigrants are to blame for all of America's ills? Of course not. That's not true. We've always had violence. We've always had misbehavior. And yes, it is true. We are a nation of immigrants. And so, as far as the present crisis goes, this is my opinion, those who are to blame are the politicians and government officials who, for political expediency, refuse to enforce the law. And not only that, but some, and I say some, in an effort to save face, are simply unwilling to admit that there is a problem. And why would they do that? Because they manufactured the problem. It's like starting a fire and then complaining about the heat. And who pays the price for this problem? Well, American citizens certainly pay the price, and I mean that most literally, in treasure, but not just in treasure, in some cases, with their lives. But I believe it's also accurate to say that in some cases, and again, I want to emphasize the word some, many of these migrants are suffering. For instance, to the smugglers who get rich by dumping them on our border, these people are considered to be no more than cargo, simply a way to make money. Many of them are actually victims of human trafficking. And then there's this. Why wouldn't these people want to come to the United States? The Biden administration has essentially thrown open the doors and let it be known that all who come will suffer little, if any, consequences of breaking our immigration laws. So then who could blame them for wanting to come? But even then, we must remember that along with those who come here seeking a better life, perhaps, are those who are willing to come here and take another's life. Our leaders need to acknowledge that among this present invasion of common people, there are also very dangerous actors. In other words, groups like TDA, many of whom are people who were released from foreign prisons and sent into the United States. And when they arrive here, they continue doing what landed them in prison in these other countries in the first place. Furthermore, when they get here, there are far too many people in power who are simply unwilling to call a spade, or for that matter, a terrorist. And let's not forget this. This has been going on for years, decades even. People have been coming across our southern border like this for decades. But it's also been well known that all these many decades, among those people, there are operatives and there are terrorists from other lands. As far back as 1984, the head of the CIA in 1984, Bill Casey, was informing President Ronald Reagan that along with these people from Central and South America were Islamic militants who were infiltrating the United States along with the people who crossed the Rio Grande. So now, we have a crisis that's obvious, and it is affecting every aspect of life here in America, not just in America. Europe is dealing with the fallout as well. But why is this happening? And I want to focus on the United States for the moment. Why is this happening here? And in my view, it's as simple as this. We forgot God. We turned our back on God. We took his blessings for granted, and now what was once a blessing is becoming a curse. It is, as he told Israel, what would occur if they turned their back on him and then go flirting with other gods. In Deuteronomy 28:33, he said, this is the result. A nation whom you have not known shall eat the fruit of your land and the produce of your labor, and you shall be only oppressed and crushed continually. Now, he says that to Israel, but the principle applies to us as well. This one nation under God has, in my view, turned to other gods, other philosophies, other ideologies, other trends, other ideas. He also said in verse 43 and 4 of the same chapter, the alien who is among you shall rise higher and higher above you, and you shall come down lower and lower. He shall lend to you, but you shall not lend to him. He shall be the head, and you shall be the tail. There are a lot of people in this nation who feel, and to some degree, it's true, have been treated like foreigners and aliens, while aliens and illegal immigrants have been treated like citizens. It's exactly what's being described here in the scripture. The Bible says that the nation whose God is the Lord is a blessed nation. So if that is the case, what happens when that nation abandons that relationship with the Almighty? Well, I'll have some thoughts on the matter. For starters, what happens? Dangerous people infiltrate your country and pose a legitimate threat to innocent people, apparently without being challenged by authorities. What happens when we embrace practices and ideologies that oppose God's will and God's purpose? I have an idea. Pro-Hamas activists will brazenly spring up on campuses across the nation. In these universities, they will chant death to Israel, death to America, and show their support for terrorist groups like Hamas, just as they did last year and just as they are doing or did at Cornell University on the very first day of the new semester, and without any fear of consequences, apparently, threatening Jewish students and others who disagree with them with intimidation and even worse. So what happens when a nation breaks covenant with God? When we do that, in short, by default, we make a covenant with death. And I'm afraid America, at some point, changed partners, turned from God and turned to another, and started dancing with the devil. And as a result, our enemies are, at the very least, at our gates, if not within our gates. Now, from this thought, I want to pivot to a story from Israel that began last week, and it's a story that I believe has some common themes with what we've been sharing here. Because, well, it's just interesting that things that happen along Israel's southern border are reflected in some ways along our southern border as well. So as Israel's war on her northern border continues to escalate, as I said, there were developments on the southern border with Gaza. In fact, this past Saturday, Hamas terrorists killed 6 hostages, including Israeli-American Hirsch Goldberg Poland. This apparently occurred as Israel Defense Forces were closing in for a rescue attempt in the tunnels that were below Gaza's Rafah settlement. According to IDF spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, he says, quote, "They were brutally murdered by Hamas terrorists shortly before we reached them," end quote. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, quote, "He who murders abductees does not want a deal. We are in a difficult day. The heart of the entire nation was torn." On the other side, the spokesperson for Hamas, their armed Al-Qassam brigades, said that the Palestinian group has issued new instructions to guards on handling hostages if Israeli forces approach detention sites. And that new instruction is kill them, kill the hostages, and all the while blaming Israel for the deaths of those hostages. Here in America, President Biden said that he is, quote, devastated and outraged by the news, adding, "Make no mistake, Hamas leaders will pay for these crimes, and we will keep working around the clock for a deal to secure the release of the remaining hostages," end quote. Now, that's a great sentiment, but I want to also point out that Biden seemed to lay the lion's share of blame not on Hamas, but on Netanyahu. In a statement, he indicated that a final deal for the release of the hostages was very close, but that he did not think Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was doing enough to secure such an agreement. In response to that, senior Israeli sources said it was, quote, remarkable, end quote, that President Biden was pressuring Netanyahu over efforts to reach a hostage deal in Gaza rather than Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. As a footnote to this, in response to the murders of these Israeli hostages, Britain decided to suspend certain arms sales to Israel rather than condemning Hamas. And of course, suspending these arms extends the war because it will impact Israel's execution of the war. Now, back here in the United States, Vice President Harris, of course, the Democratic nominee for president, said, and I quote, "Hamas is an evil terrorist organization. With these murders, Hamas has even more American blood on its hands. I strongly condemn Hamas' continued brutality, and so must the entire world. The threat Hamas poses to the people of Israel and American citizens in Israel must be eliminated, and Hamas cannot control Gaza," end quote. Very strong words from the vice president, but in my view, confusing. Seeing that, number one, Harris has always been rather pro-Palestinian, even pro-Hamas and anti-Israel. That is my view. Evidence of that is how when Netanyahu was in Washington recently, Vice President Harris skipped his address to Congress, but rushed back to D.C. to pressure Netanyahu to approve a ceasefire with Hamas. Two, the Harris campaign has stated that they are currently reviewing what their policy would be toward Israel should there be a Harris administration. In short, the particulars are that this new administration would not be nearly as cooperative with Israel, and especially in terms of selling arms, as previous administrations have been. And then there's this. The woman who was tapped by the Harris campaign to head Arab American outreach is reported as saying that pro-Israel factions were, quote, controlling U.S. politics. Now, what did others have to say about the development in Israel? Just a couple of examples. CNN's initial headline read, quote, "Israeli-American hostage, Hirsch Goldberg Poland has died. Family confirms via statement," end quote. In other words, CNN has it that he simply died while in the hands of Hamas instead of being murdered by Hamas terrorists. Likewise, the UN Secretary General refused to condemn Hamas for these atrocities, still focusing on, quote, these are his words, "the need for the unconditional release of all hostages and an end to the nightmare of war in Gaza," end quote. Seems to me that no one is willing to admit the obvious anymore. I mean, Hamas took the hostages, they knew what they were doing, it was insurance, and they killed them, and they've killed others. So no one wants to admit that, or very few people want to admit that anymore. To do so would acknowledge a flawed mindset, a flawed philosophy, or in some cases, and maybe this case where the UN Secretary General is concerned, it would reveal contempt for God and for God's people. And then there's this. At the news of these murders, protesters took to the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, demanding a deal that would secure the release of the remaining hostages. The protest included a rare call for a general strike in Israel, which led to temporary business closures and other disruptions around the country, including Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. Now, clearly, not all Israelis believe that Netanyahu should strike a deal with Hamas, but a large number of Israelis do believe that securing their release is paramount. This position, then, infers that there are Israelis who are willing to allow Hamas to remain at their southern border, thus continuing, potentially anyway, to pose a threat to the nation long term. Because if Hamas has opportunity, we know that they're going to continue with their barrage of rockets being fired on innocent civilians, and who knows, they may plan, if they haven't already, another October 7th. So that brings me to this. Is it reasonable to expect the Israeli government to make a deal with the devil? Is it reasonable to concede to the demands, or to expect them to concede to the demands of terrorists and cold-blooded killers? Now, on one hand, some will say that there's no price too great to pay in exchange for the hostages' lives, and I understand their lives are very dear, and particularly to those who love them. But then, on the other hand, there are some who would say that no price is too great to ensure the destruction of Hamas and to preserve the stability along Israel's southern border. One man, the father of an Israeli-American hostage who's still being held by Hamas, had this to say, quote, "It is absolutely clear The only way to get hostages home alive is by some kind of negotiated agreement with Satan. End quote. Satan. Now, if I were in this man's shoes, I know that I would be trying to do everything in my power to see to it that my son made it home safe. I understand this man's feelings and sentiment. I can appreciate the grief and the desperation that he and others must be feeling in regard to their family and their loved ones. But this gentleman said something that speaks not only to this issue, but to many issues, some of them unrelated to this, but many issues that are transpiring all over the world, including here in the United States. And that is this: our willingness to court the devil and make a covenant with death. In the Bible, God said that in our life's journey, there are only two options we face, and we must choose one or the other. That is, the road that leads to life and blessing, or the road that leads to death and to curse. Just as there are only two genders, not this imaginary unlimited number of genders that some people like to fantasize about. There are not unlimited options when it comes to choosing the path that we will follow as a person, as a family, as a nation. Either we choose the hard way, yes, the hard way that leads to life, or we choose the easy way that leads to death and to destruction. It seems to me that most people, given this choice, would very quickly say, yes, we want life, we want blessing, we want all of those great and wonderful things. However, we say that, but we are typically and instinctively choosing the path that takes us in the opposite direction of life and blessing. Granted, it is hard to do the right thing, and sometimes, even many times, doing the right thing means heavy costs will be incurred. It means that many will hate you and will despise you, accusing you of incredible things, outlandish things, simply because, in some cases, they want you to do what they want you to do. They want you to fix all of their warm fuzzies. Now, again, I sympathize greatly with those whose loved ones are being held hostage and suffering under the tyranny of Hamas, and that includes many innocent Palestinians who are living in the Gaza Strip. Likewise, I have sympathy for many of the migrants who have come into these United States illegally, but who came here hoping for the opportunity of a better life. But making decisions based on emotion never ends well. I've told our congregation many times, being angry and then making a decision while I'm angry has never turned out to be the best decisions I've made. It's almost always been a mistake. Because when we make decisions, whatever they may be, based on emotions, it almost always takes the path of least resistance because we want our warm fuzzies to be satisfied. And when we are on that easier path, the reality is we are on the road that leads to destruction. And so with that in mind, I want to read a couple of passages for you from Isaiah. This is in Isaiah 28, verse 15. The Lord said to his people, because you have said, quote, we have made a covenant with death and with Sheol or hell. We are in agreement with hell. When the overflowing scourge passes through, it will not come to us, for we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood we have hidden ourselves. So I read that to make this point. Whether we're talking about ignoring the crime and chaos that is unfolding in our own country because of open borders and lawlessness and an unwillingness to enforce laws to bring order, whether we're talking about that or whether we're talking about what's going on in Israel and people who feel that you can make a pact with the devil in order to get what you want, it's a dangerous thing to kid ourselves and think we can continue embracing lawlessness and not reap the fruit of chaos and violence. It's even more dangerous to pretend that we don't see that fruit, that we don't see what's happening when it is actually happening. It's foolish to think that we can make a deal with the devil and not come out on the short end of things. If we take a snake to our bosom, we will suffer the consequences. Because the Lord said this in Isaiah 28, beginning in verse 18, your covenant with death will be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol or hell will not stand. When the overflowing scourge passes through, then you will be trampled down by it. As often as it goes out, it will take you. For morning by morning it will pass over, and by day and by night. It will be a terror just to understand the report. In other words, if I may summarize what the Lord is saying to those who think they can get away with making a deal with the devil, lawlessness will never produce goodness. Embracing death or those who promote death will never render life and peace. Tares will never coexist with the wheat. The tares will always steal, kill, and destroy. Or let's put it this way. Taking the easier path, or that path that seems good and that feels good, will never bring about the values that endure. Only the pursuit of truth, righteousness, and godly order can enrich a society with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so whether it's the border issue, whether it's the Gazan war, and we could go on and on and on, hard choices have to be made. In the days and weeks and the months ahead, many more will have to face the choice between life and death, blessing and cursing. And to choose life is always the harder way because it's that straight and troublesome path that leads to life. And so there are going to be these hard choices to make both on the global scene and right here at home, because this is where it begins with you and me, our house, your house, my house. To choose what is right is a difficult thing to do at times, and there are costs involved, but the reward cannot be compared to the temporary suffering of the cost of doing what is right. There are hard choices to be made and hard choices that will cause many to turn away. And so here is what we'll conclude with today. As Joshua said to the people of Israel, you want to go back and do like your ancestors did and turn to these other gods and turn away from the true God, the one who's brought you all of this way? Okay, if you want to do that, so be it. But choose this day who you are going to serve. And if I may, choose who you're going to come into agreement with. The God of life or the God of this world who brings death and destruction. I choose to take the hard path, the one that leads to life. And as was said long ago, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I'm sure you'll make that same decision.
If you enjoyed these videos and value our content here at Jacob's Tent, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell and never miss the latest info and insights from Bill and the team. And most of all, you can help us spread the message. By sharing these videos with others, you'll be helping to grow our interactive community together.